Welcome to political philosophy. And what is that? Philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom. It's a process of using our minds to perceive the deepest truths about ourselves, our lives, and our world. So, if that's what philosophy is, adding in politics means that it's the pursuit of political wisdom, or what it means to do politics well. Now, politics will have two senses for us. There's a descriptive sense and a prescriptive sense. A description is when we characterize what something is like without necessarily giving a value judgment to it or saying anything about what it's like, whether we approve of it or disapprove of it, whether it's good or bad. Whereas prescriptions are when we do bring in something like a rule or a norm or an expectation or a value judgment about the natures of things. We're going to be talking about both. We're going to be talking about both the description of the kind of political situation we find ourselves in and the kind of political situation we should aspire to. The descriptive understanding of politics that we're going to be using is the following. Politics involves the normative structures that influence how communities of creatures coordinate and solve collection action problems. So a collection action problem is exactly as it sounds. It's when you have a group and they've got a problem that can only be solved at the level of the group. No one individual can solve the problem by themselves. So they have to work together to figure out the problem. If any of you have done groups escape rooms before, which are super fun, that's an example of a collective action problem. You have to work together. If any of you have played the video games Biped or Portal where you play with a partner. Those are games where the only way to solve the puzzles in those games is for the two players to work together. So that's the descriptive sense of politics, where we are talking about normative structures, but we're simply describing what they are, not whether they should be. By contrast, when we're talking about the prescriptive sense of politics, we're thinking of politics as the exchange of reasons between responsible agents for the common good. That's going to be a bigger theme in future lectures. In this way, then, politics is a normative activity in both senses. Politics is not simply being in community, it's being in a community under these overarching superintending structures that determine how we are to be in community. There are, of course, other structures besides politics, but politics is going to be that most salient one because it's where we try to solve those collection action problems. So that is not going to be immediately obvious to you what we mean by this overarching structure because the structure that is politics is largely invisible. It's not something you can taste or see or touch. So to help us make sense of what some of these structures are, we're going to go through an opinionated history of the origin of politics. Now, this is not a straight anthropological record account. This is a combination of episodes from actual human history and actual animal history, but it's also some just so stories that serve to capture some of those key transitions in human history. So, with that, once upon a time, there was no politics. There were just creatures swimming in the oceans and foraging upon the lands. Then, about 3 million years ago, mammals evolved and populated the earth. Now, why are mammals important? Well, mammals are these special creatures that have complex nervous systems and brain structures, but most importantly, they give birth to live young. See, most creatures, they have young that when they hatch out of some kind of egg, they're ready to go. But with mammals, there has to be this nurturing process, this rearing process that brings their live birth young from whatever state infant state that they're in to a more mature state. So this means that these individual creatures are no longer individuals. They're intrinsically embedded into this familial and even communal type structure that allows them to survive over time. Their parents or the whole herd will provide protection, food, sometimes even instruction on how to become a thriving individual. So you become an individual mammal only through the investment of the community in your survival. This means mammals depend on long-term mating relationships and herds where the community, whether it's through instinct or some type of basic calculation, can nonetheless solve collective action problems together and help each other survive. So this raises obviously the problem of how do creatures with complex emotional and cognitive lives work together to promote not only the survival of their young, but the survival of the whole herd. So they're moving from sort of a self-preservational model of the species to a species, or not species level, but a group level preservational model. Now, what this produced was an amazing history of mating rituals, group hierarchies, signaling behaviors, recreational sex and games, pecking orders, harems, alpha males and females, and so on. Birds evolved later on, and they also echo some of these traits, even though they don't give live births. You'll notice that birds nest and nurture their young and are like mammals in being warm-blooded. So there is going to be some overlap with other creatures that came on the scene after mammals. Now, it's important to understand we're talking about creatures that are entirely instinctual and emotional in nature. I think it's right to call what they're doing a politics, but it's not a politics in our sense. It is a politics in the sense of they've got sort of structures that are working within the community that the individual creatures are conforming to, but they're not doing so consciously. And they're not thinking about politics. They're not trying to aspire to political goals. They don't philosophize about social relationships, they simply do them. Now, there is one very small subset of the animal kingdom that are especially salient to us, and that's our animal forebears, primates. They also don't philosophize about politics, but they do have a much richer set of political relations. They negotiate, they trade, they lie to one another. They have these really elaborate grooming and foraging rituals, um, really sophisticated sexual behaviors that are clearly designed to ameliorate tensions and so forth, or exacerbate tensions in some cases. They have complex signaling systems for communicating about predators and pleasure and desires and so forth. So primates give us sort of the richest fodder from the animal kingdom that's going to then lead to humans. So humans evolved from primates, and for much of human history, we didn't think about political relations either, even though we were doing them. So we spend most of our history in these small hunter-gatherer tribes that spread across the Eastern African continent, through the Mediterranean and Europe, through parts of the Asian subcontinent. These are family units or multiple family units that sort of are bonded into a tribe, um, coordinating for Hunts is a big deal. Coordinating for protection is a big deal. Coordinating for finding shelter, especially from storms, is a big deal. And there are some hierarchies that are going to begin to evolve. Anthropologists have noticed that in general, modern day hunter-gatherer societies tend to be much more egalitarian by modern standards, but there's still a sense in which, whether it's in particular roles or in particular tribes, that there is some sense that someone's leading and others are following. Okay, and that's really the basis of politics. Now, all of this changes when we develop language, because language allows us to do two things that no other animal can do. The first is we could name the leaders of societies with a title, which is not the same thing as a name. So my name is Michael, but some of you call me instructor or professor. Those are titles, and those mean something different. Those are not my names. They represent the role or authority that I have in relationship to you. So titles back then might have been elder, chief, great warrior, head mother, so on. And the idea is that these things are becoming a way of naming something invisible. Because a name, that points to the visible person. You can touch the person. You can obviously reach out and touch me if I were in person. But you can't touch the office of being an instructor or a professor. So that's an invisible thing. That's something that we can only conceptualize. And so being able to give a title to someone allows us to talk about that invisible office. I give an example here of the most famous of them all. That is the title of Caesar, which was originally the name of a person, Julius Caesar, but as successive emperors wanted to make it clear to everyone that I'm just as much in charge as Julius Caesar was, they started calling themselves Caesar, and so Caesar became the name of the Roman emperor. But again, not the name of the individual person per se, but the name of the office they were holding. But there's a second, even more amazing thing that language gave human history, and that was once you can name a title to an office, then you can begin to reflect on who should have that title, who should be in that office. So Julius Caesar, as you know, if you've read your Shakespeare, was famously assassinated by a whole bunch of Roman senators who disagreed with his holding of the office. And we see this throughout human history, as far back as we can discern any type of history. Um, we see human communities having this sense that when the leader of their society dies, there's this question of who should take over next. And oftentimes the way they solved this was through hereditary relations. Um, Somebody who is a key bloodline descendant takes their place. And this is probably due to superstition. Even though they didn't have any conception of genes or the passing on of one's genes, they still had some idea that um, if if I'm my father's child, then I share my father's blood in some sense. And therefore they thought, well, if my father is a good leader, maybe I'll be a good leader. So we're going to put you in charge. This is, of course, the beginning of the idea of nobility, the idea that some people are of a superior cut of human because of the people they descend from. And that is an idea that persists to this day. Okay, so inevitably, the bloodline inheritance system uh, doesn't make a clean system of inheritance over time for obvious reasons. I mean, what if the leader doesn't have any bloodline children? Or what if, say, you're in a patriarchal society and the leader only has daughters, and you think, well, only men can rule. Well, then your system is going to cause some dispute over who should be next in line. So you can see this with the Disney film, The Lion King. Scar assassinates Mufasa and then tries to kill Simba, who is Mufasa's son, because then that would eliminate the male heir and Scar can assume the throne at Pride Rock. A very different kind of complication in the story comes from the Hebrew tale of Jacob and Esau. Their father, Isaac, is the patriarch. And so there's this question, well, the patriarch's got two sons. Who should be in charge? Well, they developed a convention that, not Isaac per se, but in that time they had this convention that the eldest son should inherit the leadership roles of the father. So Esau is the eldest son and therefore has the birthright, the right by birth to become essentially his father, to take his father's role one day. One day Esau comes home from a hunt, he's famished, and his younger brother Jacob says, hey, I'll hook you up with some homemade stew if you promise me that birthright. This is because of some machinations that were happening behind the scene with Jacob and his mom, because his mom liked him more than Esau, and she kind of wanted him to be in charge. And so Esau did it. He was kind of in a desperate moment and probably wasn't thinking super clearly. And then, of course, later regretted his decision, became angry with Jacob, and they had a severe falling out that required Jacob to flee. So again, this is part of the complication of we have this convention that says who's going to rule, but because we have language that allows us to name the invisible things, Jacob could name the birthright, which is not something you can point to and touch. It's this idea that there's this right that Esau has. And so he can say, hey, give that to me. And so there was this like joust over who's next in line. So these are some stories about conventions and leadership roles and the way those conventions broke down. And this is the origin of our full-blown conception of politics. This is what we do that the animals can't do in their more prosaic understanding of, well, not understanding, but practice of politics, okay? We're able to use language to do things with politics that they can't. Now, I want to be clear here, the we is not a universal we. We're not talking about all the humans because many humans are being excluded from some of these processes and disputes altogether. People such as slaves, children, women, those lower in status or wealth, and so on. So we have to be careful as we talk about this. We're talking about humans generically. We're not talking about all humans. Now, of course, all of the people I just mentioned are still being affected by politics, but they're not always participating in the machinations of politics. A little bit more about this history of who should be in charge, who the leader should be. We've discussed here this idea of bloodline descent, often in a sexed bloodline descent that determines who is next in line for the position of leadership. If there are no progeny, no children in line, then conventions start to work like, well, then it goes to your brother or sister, it goes to your aunt or uncle or whatever, things like that. And this is a lot like the line of succession we have in the United States with respect to the president, where if the president dies unexpectedly or is incapacitated, there's a clear order of succession of who takes their place. But there's another convention that developed fairly early on that's pretty important to this, and that's the idea of destiny. So some leaders who were in charge, they started talking as if it was the fate of the universe or it was the providence of the gods that I would be in charge. And there's a very good reason for this developing. If the gods are sort of seen as the highest authority in a society, then saying that the gods put you there is a pretty good way to get get everybody else to agree that you should be in charge. Going back to the Roman Empire, for example, we have the case of Augustus Caesar, who is the Caesar who took over after Julius Caesar was assassinated. And he had the imperial armies loyal to him, but he wanted to get all of the people and, the various office holders and the government loyal. And so one way that he did that was by giving himself a title. Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, which means Commander Caesar, son of God. So he's sort of like Hercules or something like that, where he's a human in some sense, but he's also divine in another sense. He's of the gods, and therefore to mess with Augustus Caesar is to mess with the gods. In later history, the idea of the divine right of monarchs would be introduced, which suggested that whoever held the throne did so because the supreme deity had intervened in history and established that monarch as ruler. So here we've got an even stronger idea that um, that the gods or the supreme god has a particular person that they want to occupy the throne, and they're going to manipulate human affairs to make that happen. It won't surprise you that these two ideas actually eventually merged over time, where how did you know who had the divine right to rule? It was whoever was the correct bloodline descendant of the current ruler, and so on. So again, the purpose of telling you all of this is to give you a sense that one of the core problems of politics that gives rise to the existence of politics in the first place is this question of, hey, we humans, we've got to work together to solve collective action problems. But there's this question of like, who does what? And most specifically, like at the end of the day, who makes the decisions? Who decides what we're going to do and how we're going to solve this? Which now allows us to talk about our big idea for this video, which is the notion that might makes right. So this is a deeper explanation for how politics developed to have the particular character that it does. Whatever explanation someone like Augustus Caesar gives for their various titles at the top of the Roman hierarchy, the real reason why Augustus Caesar is because he commands the imperial legions, which at the time was the most powerful army in the Northern Hemisphere. He's got control over these armies, and so if you don't think he should be the Caesar, yeah, he can just send some of his uh, troops over to pay you a visit and either change your mind or disappear you from the earth. And no matter how far back in history you go, there's always going to be somebody who occupies a position of political power who can't claim something like a hereditary bloodline or a divine right because either they were the first of their bloodline to hold that position, or they held that position before some of the religious traditions about the gods had even come onto the scene. And so there's this question of like, then how did they get there? How did they have that political power? And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, it's because they took it by force. They killed whoever was currently in power, or beat them up in some way. Or a little later in human history, when armies started to develop, you took your army and you went over and you conquered them and their army. And that allowed it so that now you are in charge of their lands. You're now the kingpin for that area. And so there, these rulers who come to power through these means are in charge because they have the power to enforce their will on everyone else through violence. They can use their armies or their military strength or even their individual strength to impose their will. And this is true even back in the earliest communities. In fact, before humans come on the scenes, when we just look at primates, we see primates doing this kind of thing. So gorilla males will fight for the control of a harem, which is a small cluster of gorilla females. And they all mate with one dominant male. And how does that dominant male get decided? By some really nasty brawls. Whoever wins the brawls gets the women. So this ability to actually physically dominate all your competitors for a leadership position means you get the leadership position. When I was a kid, we used to play the game at recess, Boss on the Hill. So you're up on this like mound of dirt, and there's all these other kids around you screaming and hollering. And the idea is they're going to run up the hill, smack into you, and try to knock you off. And whoever's boss of the hill is whoever can stay up there the longest or indefinitely or something like that, right? And that's kind of what early human communities started doing when there was some kind of contest of power for who should be in charge. Now, as the human communities grew in size, this meant also there started to be conflicts between villages and so forth. And so you might be worried that a rival village is going to come over and burn your house down and take all your stuff. And so this means the people in charge of your village might not just be those who can assume power from everybody else in the village by being the strongest or the most dominant, but also who can protect the village from other rival villages who might wish them harm. So the power to protect became just as important as the power to eliminate all your competitors, if you will. Okay. And of course, as we developed agriculture and started building cities and so forth, we got even bigger in size, and that allowed us to start developing militias and even standing armies. So now it's not about, who's got the biggest muscles or who can win the wrestling match, because that doesn't matter anymore. It's about who can command the loyalty of the generals of your army, because now national power, how much land you control, who dominates who is determined by warfare. And this remains true to this day. There are many, many countries around the world where the only way you can hold the prime minister's office or the president's office is by getting the support of the military. If they don't support you, you can't enforce any of your commands. And so nobody's going to do what you say because who's going to make them? And so all of this gives rise to this kind of political concept of might makes right, which is the one who makes the rules and the decisions is the one who can enforce the rules and the decisions through physical violence. The people who should rule are the people who have the power to rule. Okay. And down through history, this has produced many, many different kinds of governments. So we've had democracies. These are governments where the military rules directly, the generals are in charge. you think of Francisco Franco's rule in Spain in the middle of the 20th century, that would be a good example. We've had plutocracy. This is where the richest people rule. So wealth is a form of power, and there have been societies where the rich are those who hold all the positions of leadership. In many ways, the United States was founded as a plutocracy because at its founding, the only people who had the right to vote or the ability to hold office were people who held land. Land was a form of wealth. So if you were part of a landed male, then you could participate in politics. Democracies are also a form of might makes right, at least where the primary function of the democracy is to give power to the majority, right? If you're a majority, that means there's more of you than there is of any of the other factions. And so you can, if there's more of you, you can beat them all up, or you can out protest them, or you can outvote them, or whatever it is, however your democracy functions, the number of the majority is what maintains their power. Oligarchies are kind of the contrast of this. This is where a minority faction holds political power in a society, and that's usually through repressive means. That means they've done something in the society to keep the majority of the society under subjugation. And the classic example of this is, of course, apartheid in South Africa, when the minority white Afrikaners held exclusive power over Black South Africans. They were very much the minority, but they used all sorts of political repressive tactics to make it so that the Black folk couldn't organize in a way to take power away from the white Afrikaners. And then, of course, there's dictatorships. A dictatorship is when a single person has absolute power over all aspects of political life. That's not because they're the biggest, toughest SOB to come walking down the block. That's because they command loyalty from across the government, usually because they've networked people, they've called in lots of favors, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's afraid to cross them. There are lots of dictators even in the world today. So these are all instances of might makes right, because I, in some way, can physically dominate you. That gives me the right to tell you what to do. Okay. And that means that whoever has the power of might makes right, they get to make the rules. They get to tell other people what the laws are, how the government's going to be structured, who the government will advocate on behalf of and who they won't, what your rights are, what they aren't, etc. So building on all these ideas, the Greek philosopher Plato has a character in one of his most famous dialogues on politics, the Republic, in which this character's sort of role is to give voice, give an argument for why you would want to build a society on the principle of might makes right. This character is Thrasymachus, which is actually based on a real life person, but the actual speech that Thrasymachus gives is not, as far as we know, an actual historical speech. And in his speech, he describes how all the different types of governments I was just mentioning, they all feature some kind of system in which the people in power coerce everybody else to do what benefits the people in power. So if it's a plutocracy, the laws seem to function so that the rich get richer. If it's a timocracy, the military uses the laws to quell dissent. If it's a democracy, the majority will try to, gerrymander and do different things to make it so that they can keep political power in the next election. And finally, oligarchies And oligarchs and dictators use all manner of means of repression to ensure that the masses cannot revolt. But Thrasymachus goes on to say that what we call justice in a society is nothing more than people doing what they're told, following the laws of the people in power. But of course, those laws he thinks are created to benefit the people in power. And so when you're being a just person or when you're advocating for justice, what you really do is just going along with what the people in power want you to do because it will benefit them. So justice, he says, is whatever is to the advantage of the stronger, that is, the people who have political power. And that means that injustice is whatever is to the advantage of the people in power as well, because they're acting in their own interests. We'll come back to that in a moment. First, to understand what he means by justice is simply that which is to the advantage of the stronger. Think about it like this. Let's say that you have a hospital emergency and the hospital charged you a large bill. You send it to your health insurance and they reject the claim. It's not covered under their policies. Now, why would they do that? Well, because it's in their interest to avoid paying as much as they can. Like they don't, they want to pay as few claims as they can, so they keep as much of the premium money as they can. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, one thing you could do is you could grab your torch and your gasoline can and you could go down to the local insurance headquarters and you could burn it to the ground. I'd show them. But you don't. Why not? Well, because that's breaking the law. I mean, that's arson. If you do that, you're probably going to get arrested and go to jail. So you say, well, I'm a good citizen. I obey the law. I don't get in trouble. So I'm not going to burn down the insurance company, even though I'm really, really mad. So what are you going to do then? Well, maybe you'll file an appeal. You'll try to get them to change their minds. Those are the legal means. But let's say that you pursue those legal options and it just doesn't work out. At the final appeal, you get denied and you're stuck with the legal bills. You got screwed. And so you say, well, I got screwed, but I'm a good citizen, so I'm going to go along with the law and I'm just going to have to deal with it. Now, if you got screwed, to whose advantage was all these laws surrounding health insurance? Well, it went to the advantage of the insurance company and probably whoever they're lobbying. They're the ones who are going to make out having to pay less money because they don't have to pay your medical bills. You didn't make out very well. And so, since they're the ones who have more power than you do, because they can lobby all of the politicians to be on their side, you being a good citizen is actually to their advantage. You not, messing with the system, not causing trouble, makes it so that they can keep doing what they're doing and keep denying claims to people like you. By contrast, Thrasymachus says, the bad citizen, the one who is quite willing to break the laws in favor of their self-interest, well, that's an unjust person. They're violating the laws of justice. But they're doing it because they want to be the one who screws others and not get screwed themselves. So let's give another example here. When the DuPont Chemical Company, this is a real case, when the DuPont Chemical Company discovered that Teflon products were poisoning their employees and possibly their customers, they hid the evidence because their Teflon products were a billion-dollar moneymaker. So they committed illegal acts to make money off of harmful products. And when a few ordinary citizens figured this out and tried to sue them, the DuPont lawyers would get the cases thrown out of court. And so Thrasymachus, sort of comparing sucking it up and having to pay your medical bills because the insurance won't help you. Thrasymachus says, see, you were a good, just person and you got screwed. Meanwhile, Thrasymachus is going to look at DuPont and he's going to say, and look, they broke the law and they made tons of money over it. So it's better to be unjust than just. If you're just, you're just following the law, which helps somebody powerful. But if you're unjust, that means you're doing things to help yourself. You're going to be the one who does the exploiting. You're not going to let other people exploit you. And so, the best life possible, according to Thrasymachus, is the life of a dictator. Somebody who gets to dominate everybody. You don't like what somebody's doing, you send your armies over there to cut their heads off. That's the best life possible because you make all the rules and nobody tells you what to do. And so that leads to our main topic for today, domination. Domination is one of the great patterns of politics. It's not the only one. In later videos, I'll be talking about other patterns, but it's one of the big patterns of our political history. Think of domination as one type of political relationship that we have with each other. In the same dialogue by Plato, The Republic, Glaucon, who's another character, describes the world of humans this way. He says, we're creatures such that we love to be in charge. We like to be the head honcho, the one calling the shots, making the decisions, deciding what the great vision is, and so forth. And we like to have others sing our praises and give us gifts and do us favors. And we even have a little bit of cruelty in us if we're often. Um, let's say that there's a really nasty job that has to be done in the house. Let's say that the toilet has backed up and it's disgusting and someone needs to go plunge the toilet. And you discover that the toilet needs to be plunged. And you're like, I don't want to plunge that toilet. So you go and you tell your mom, you say, Mom, my sister just backed up the toilet and she didn't even do anything about it. Can you make her go and unclog the toilet? And then your mom goes and makes your sister do it. And of course, she's in there mad, like, why do I have to do this? This wasn't my fault. And you're over there giggling to yourself because you're like, ha 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 ha. I got my sister to do it and I didn't even have to do it. And that's cruel. But it's a type of domination because we don't want to have to do unpleasant things. So we're going to make somebody else do it so that we don't have to. This is domination. Humans like to dominate other humans. Domination is a unilateral relationship where we can coerce other people, but they can't coerce us. Now, here's the thing though. In that example I just gave of you making your sister plunge the toilet, she's not happy about it. She's really pissed, actually, that this is happening to her. So what that means is, although you got some giggles out of tricking your mom and dominating your sister, she's not enjoying being dominated. And so that's sort of the great asymmetry of this particular relation. We like to be the one in charge. We don't like to be the one who's not in charge. We don't like to be the one who we're pushed around. We're forced to have to clean the toilet and so forth. Okay. Now, Glaucon observes that if we're being honest, there's only a few people in the world in each social context who are skilled enough or strong enough to become a dictator, whether it's at the level of governments like Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist during World War II, or even at a more prosaic level, like when we're in primary school and there's a schoolyard bully. Usually there's only a small number of schoolyard bullies. We can't all be the bully, okay? So that means people who can be in a clear dominating relationship and get away with it tend to be pretty small in number. Most of us are not powerful enough or rich enough or have private armies or anything like that to seize the halls of power for ourselves. So, since we can't dominate and we don't like being dominated by others, we're willing to compromise. We're willing to say, hey, let's make a set of laws that say, I won't dominate you if you don't dominate me. So we're going to create a society with a social contract where none of us gets to do what we really want to do, which is to be the one in charge, the price we pay to avoid what we really don't want to have happen, which is to have somebody else who's got all the power. Okay. Now, the one thing we should note, though, is that the few dictators and schoolyard bullies out there, they might not go along with these schemes because they think they actually can dominate everybody and get away with it. But for the rest of us, we're going to try to like have this truce that we make where we all say, hey, we're going to try to not dominate each other. And these types of relationships that Glaucon is talking about actually are reflected in the world today. So during the Cold War, when there was the big worry about nuclear weapons being used, the way the United States and their NATO allies and the Soviet Union sort of navigated that very dangerous time period was with the policy of MAD, which stands for mutually assured destruction. The idea being here that if the United States launches all their nukes on the Soviet Union, that's going to wipe out the Soviet Union, but not before they launch all of their nukes, which are going to wipe out the United States. So if I launch on you, that means I'm dying too. Yeah, I'm going to take you out, but you're going to take me out. And so that mutual threat kept them from not ever acting on it with each other. It's not that they didn't want to have domination over each other. I guarantee you that the United States wanted to knock the Soviet Union off of the geopolitical map. I guarantee you that the Soviet Union wanted to expand their control around the globe. But they also didn't want to be wiped out. And so they wanted to dominate, but they instead adopted the MAD policy as a compromise. Likewise, the Biden administration uses a form of peace through strength, which involves building up a powerful military force as a deterrent to other countries who are kind of getting itchy trigger fingers and thinking about starting something. The idea being, hey, you want to attack this? If you attack this, we're going to come attack you. So if you don't want me and my big army messing with you, don't come over here and mess with us. Now, this idea of might makes right provides a really important thread through human political practice. It means that political power is accumulating not in the hands of those who are good or those who are wise or those who are trying to establish peace or make everyone's lives better. It's that political power is accumulating in the hands of those who have the best ability to dominate. Okay. Now, the reality of the situation is actually quite complex because it's easy to listen to a story that I've just told and think that, oh, well, all this really means is that we just have to make sure that nobody becomes a dictator and we're good. But actually, human life is made up of lots and lots of little political contexts. It's not like there's one politics. There's actually lots and lots of political systems happening at all different levels. And so it can be the case that we're somebody very much committed to non-domination in one area and then practicing domination in another area. So let's look at an example. In the Bible, Jesus tells a story of a king who calls in a servant to pay a large debt. The servant doesn't have the money, and so they beg for debt forgiveness from the king. Hey, I can't possibly pay this. Please, please cut me some slack. The king shows mercy, forgives the debt. And so what this particular context shows is the servant does not have the power to force the king to forgive them. So all they can do is plead with him, beg, hey, king, please don't dominate me. I can't dominate you. So all I can do is beg and please, hey, don't dominate me. Don't call in this debt. And so the king relents and says, okay, I won't dominate you. I won't make you pay that debt. But then Jesus says that when the servant left the king's presence, they ran into another servant, one who was lower ranking than them, and who owed them a small debt. And they start beating this servant up and saying, hey, pay me my money. I'm feeling like a big shot right now. I just caught a break, and now I'm going to take the money that you owe me from me. And that servant says, hey, 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 cut me some slack. Give me some mercy. The servant says, no way. I'm going to make you pay every last dime that you owe me. So even though they begged for mercy from the king, who they couldn't dominate, that didn't stop them from now going to the other person who they could dominate and saying, I'm going to show you who's boss. Of course, as Jesus tells the story, the king eventually finds out about this and reimposes the original debt back on the offending servants. So we might be champions of liberty in one area of our lives, maybe at our place of work, while being tyrants in a whole other area of our lives, such as the way that we treat our families at home. So we have to think of domination in this very multifaceted way. So to wrap up this discussion of domination, I want to focus on a particular system of domination and how it is much more pervasive than we realize. Of course, I'm talking about slavery. Now, a major problem with talking about slavery today is that we have a kind of narrow conception of what slavery is and where it shows up in the world. We think that slavery is some antiquated thing of the past, but it isn't. Slavery is alive and well today. So to see this, we're going to need to look at some more fine-grained conceptions of what slavery is. So here are the systems of slavery in the world that I want us to focus on. There may be more, so this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but it'll give us a really robust idea to understand just how pervasive political relations of domination really are. These are the 5 categories. Chattel slavery. That's the forced labor of humans through the ownership of their bodies. Caste slavery. The forced labor of humans through the subjugation of peoples by social rank, race, or sex. Debt slavery, the forced labor of humans by enforcing liens or judicial sentences against them. Wage slavery, the forced labor of humans by unfair labor contracts. And finally, beast slavery, the forced labor and slaughter of non-human animals through ownership of their bodies. See, we often congratulate ourselves for the abolition of slavery. Well, what we're really talking about when we discuss the history of the international slave trade is we're talking about a particular type of slavery, not just chattel slavery, which is the first on our list, but legal chattel slavery. See, there are plenty of humans around the world today who are still unfortunately trafficked, who are owned, bought, and sold as part of illegal black markets, most often for sex work and prostitution. So, sorry about that. My computer just jumped to the wrong screen. Let's try that again. So, these are, of course, illegal activities. And that means they're wrong, but they're still happening. So what actually happened in the 19th century when the British Empire abolished the legality of chattel slavery, and then other empires and the United States followed suit in their wake, is they made it so that chattel slavery was no longer protected by the legal system of those countries. And that's huge. That's a very important accomplishment. But that's not the same thing as abolishing chattel slavery entirely. That has persisted throughout human history and continues to persist today. There are a lot of reasons for this. We're not going to go into the sociological reasons for chattel slavery because this is a philosophy class. But I do want us to understand some of the philosophical reasons behind the pervasiveness of this practice. One reason is that most humans accept the assumption that some people are inferior to others. Obviously, it's usually the people who can't engage in domination that are the ones who get labeled inferior. Since some people have less power, they are viewed to have less power by nature. There's some kind of structure to the universe that says, yeah, they should be the ones who are have less agency and power in the world, and therefore, since I have more agency and power in the world, it's only right that I should use my agency and power to exploit them. Another reason that chattel slavery persists is because in the ancient world, one of the best ways to ensure that a wartime victory of one nation over another nation would last is to not just assume that the defeated nation would be like, okay, you won, we won't mess with you anymore. But no, to ensure they won't mess with you again by taking their soldiers and sometimes even their civilians as slaves. So you take all of them into your lands as people in chains and subject to forced labor. And then that way you can make sure that they can't form an army, raise taxes to fund that army, and then start another war with you in the future. So those are some historical reasons for why slavery has not been, chattel slavery has not been viewed as an evil, but actually something that is part of ordinary political practice. A third reason for the persistence of chattel slavery is economics. Slaves have functioned as a kind of currency. Your wealth is measured in how many slaves you have, how much labor you can exploit out of them. And so they can be bought and sold on markets. And again, that's an economic transaction. Reflect back to what I said earlier about the basic impulse that many of us have that we want to dominate, we just don't want to be dominated. If I have a tribe of people, we might be successful if we all work hard together to accomplish the goods of a community, but that means we all have to do the work, and that means we're not able to do other things we might rather be doing. So wouldn't it be nice if instead of us doing the work, we go to the next village over and we beat them up, put them in chains, drag them back to our village, and we make them do the work while we sit around and, drink Mai Tais and watch the football game. That's the temptation of chattel slavery. We need labor to make the world move, to make societies grow, to build houses and to build, recreational centers and movie theaters and all these things we distract ourselves with. We need people to grow food. All of this requires labor activity. So either we can do it or we can make somebody else do it at gunpoint. That's been much more tempting to humans than I think we often want to admit. Moreover, there's a lot of work that's dangerous or disgusting or just things that we view to be inferior to the kinds of people we are. This creates a great asymmetry in labor. My educational background is at Stanford University, and one of the things that I always felt when I was in the philosophy department there is when the Hispanic custodian would come in to clean our bathrooms, I thought, why do we need somebody else to clean our bathrooms? We could just as easily have a rota in the department where the faculty take turns on whose job is it to clean the toilets that week. And we don't because, frankly, big shot professors think that that kind of work is beneath them. They have more important things to do. So that's still a mindset where we think there's just some labor that lesser people should do. And see, the value of chattel slavery, this is where you own somebody's body. They're not even free over their own body, is it allows you to get free labor. They do all the work and it hardly costs you anything. Maybe you throw them a few chicken scraps here and there to eat, but other than that, you don't pay them wages. You don't pay them in sick days or vacation days or anything like that. You don't give them health care. And so it doesn't cost you much, and you get all the results of their labor. Okay, chattel slavery is horrible. It is a truly evil, evil thing. I want people to understand that even though I talk about these dominance relations, it's because I want you to understand them, not because I'm praising them. Chattel slavery means that not only does a person not have control over their labor, they don't even have control over their body. Because of this, they are regularly sexually abused, diseased, malnourished, and they often die premature and ignoble deaths when they begin to lose their economic value to their masters. But that is not the only form of slavery in the world, legal or illegal. There are others. Caste slavery has continued to persist even long after the abolition of legal chattel slavery. And caste slavery is still practiced in many parts of the world. For example, after the United States abolished the legal practice of chattel slavery, white supremacists in the South simply switched to a caste system where blacks were kept poor and inferior in the United States, and they were only able to work menial and underpaid jobs, and they were treated in dehumanizing ways. They weren't allowed into certain spaces. They weren't allowed to participate fully in public and political life. So even though they technically didn't have their bodies owned, so they weren't chattel slaves, they were still caste slaves and existed in a caste system where there was a clear hierarchy in the world. You can find this in other parts of the world. Very famously, India had a caste system, which it's not an area of expertise that I have, but my understanding is a lot of people think that caste system was either created or exacerbated by some of the colonial occupations of India. The idea is that there were these different ranks of the society, and as such, whatever rank you were born into determined what kinds of labor you could participate in. There were just whole parts of the society that were blocked off from you because of your birth and nothing else. Had nothing to do with your skills or anything like that, just who were your parents. Um, if any of you have watched the Downton Abbey TV series or movies, you'll see a good example of a chattel slave system that continued in the Commonwealth nations of the British Empire. Should change that to British. Um, you know, once again, there's a lack of social mobility. You're sort of trapped into these different levels. simply because of either your birth or the rank that you're perceived to have based on the kind of clothes you wear, the type of accent you have, um, the way you look, hair color, all of those kinds of absurd and totally irrelevant characteristics allow people to get forced into certain types of boxes that determine, say, who sits at the nice table versus who serves the people sitting at the nice table versus the people who are so low in rank, they're not even allowed to come into the room with the people who serve the people at the nice table. And I want to mention as my last one something you probably have not thought of as a caste slavery system, but it actually is, and that's sex discrimination. And I don't just mean in the workplace. The expectation that women in many countries should not be able to go out and participate in the ordinary labor market is an example of segregating people into a caste where the castes are determined by your sex. So if a woman's role is to do homely duties, cleaning the house, making food, nursing the children, etc., then that's again a determination of what you can do based on your birth. And for some societies, that labor is forced upon women, meaning it's considered your duty as a woman to get married. And once you're married, it's considered your duty to perform those pieces of labor for your husband. And that labor has economic value. If you think about the cost of childcare today, if you think about the cost of having a maid come and clean your house, if you think about the cost of having a cook make your food, or the cost of eating out at restaurants, if we valued the labor of a housewife according to all of those things, most housewives that have been a part of those sex discrimination households are performing 80 to $100,000 worth of labor throughout their lives. That's real valued labor, but they never get paid for it. They don't get a wage. My own mother was a dental assistant. My dad worked for the state of California in the Department of Transportation. And when I was born, my mom made the decision to leave her job and become a full-time stay-at-home mom. But when she did that, we went from being a two-income household to being a one-income household. Our, household income got slashed. Why is that? Was my mom lazy? Did she stop working? No, she didn't do any of those things. Now, I don't think my mom was necessarily in a caste slavery system. My dad was not forcing her to do these things. She did choose them. But although it was a free choice, what didn't happen is she wasn't continued to be paid for all of the labor that she was providing by being my mom. So when we start to realize this, we realize that we still live in societies where people perform labor that is a huge benefit to society, and they're not paid for that labor. That's free labor, and in many cases, it's forced labor. And once it becomes forced labor, it's just another system of slavery. The third category of slavery I mentioned is debt slavery. This is absolutely present with us today. In fact, I would say debt slavery is among the most common forms of slavery in the world today. And in most nations, especially the United States, debt slavery is almost entirely legal. Debt slavery is when people can force you to work to either pay off a financial debt or to work off a prison sentence. I'm going to mention the second one here quickly because I want to spend more time focusing on financial debt just because I don't have enough time to cover everything. But I do want to mention that prison sentences throughout history um, have often been imposed for very specious reasons. So criminal courts have not been traditionally fair throughout human history. So you can get sentenced for all kinds of reasons. And many times, somebody who is found guilty of some kind of sentence, especially if it's something like sedition or dissent or speaking out against the government, the punishment you receive is being sent to a labor camp where the prisoners provide the state labor that has enormous economic value, but they don't get paid for it. Okay. Instead, they're working off a prison sentence, although throughout history, for example, I mentioned here the gulag camps of the Soviet Union. That's a place where oftentimes people would go with no hope of a reprieve in their prison sentence. They're just sentenced for life, and they're in the gulag camp providing labor that is of value to the state, and they're not getting paid for it, and they're not even free. I mean, in those cases, their bodies are controlled, so it's awfully close to a chattel slave system. Um, so that's one category. I'm not going to go further into that. I want to talk more about the other form of debt slavery, which is where you are compelled by the state to have to pay off a lien of some sort that is held against you by somebody to whom you owe money. The more familiar example of this is the poorhouses in the United Kingdom in the 19th century. So in 1834, the United Kingdom passed a law restricting social relief for the poor and unemployed to only those living in workhouses, which were these really, really, really awful places to live. Those who ventured inside a workhouse would receive a small pittance in exchange for grueling labor. So you do really, really tough jobs and you'd get paid a tiny, tiny amount. And of course, everything you got paid didn't actually go to you, it would go to whoever you owed money to. And see, this law replaced an older English practice called outdoor relief, which was a charitable system that would make sure people who were poor or who had lost their jobs could come and receive food, warm blankets, and clothing free of charge. There were no conditions for receiving this. If you were in need, you could come and get help. The newer law, so if you think the law is always progressive and always getting better, that is absolutely not true. There are plenty of instances in history where there were good laws and then the next set of reforms were actually worse. The newer policy was called indoor relief, and that said people receiving public support only get that support in exchange for work. So they have to work to get the relief. Jeremy Bentham was one of the leading proponents of this. And he suggested that humans, by nature, only want to do things that feel good and not things that don't. Well, that seems pretty, that seems like a fair observation. But he then said, because work is not fun and getting unconditional poverty relief is nicer than work, he said the only way to discourage people from being lazy and living on free poverty relief is to make it conditional on grueling work, meaning to give them the pleasant thing that they want. You have to force them to do the unpleasant thing they don't want to do. He thought that this would incentivize people to work hard so that they would earn enough money to not fall into debt and have to go to the workhouses. Okay. So the idea here is we're going to threaten you with this really awful state of affairs so that you're going to bust your butt really hard to make sure that doesn't happen to you. And that is forced labor. So this debt slave system is being used to force people to work, either to work off their debts in the workhouse or to work really, really hard at their jobs outside of the workhouse because they're afraid of getting so poor that they'll have to go to the workhouse. But in both cases, it's forced labor. And if it's forced labor, it's slavery. Um, and I want to note that work conditional programs are almost universal here in the United States. So if you're looking down your nose at the United Kingdom in the 19th century and you're thinking, how cruel, yeah, we have milder versions of that here. We don't have workhouses, thankfully, but most of our unemployment benefits, for example, are tied to you worked in the past and you paid into the unemployment benefit system, and B, you're trying to find work now, and we'll only pay you benefits if you're actively looking for a job. So that's still a kind of conditional requirement on benefits. Let's look at a few other contemporary examples of debt so that you can get a better grasp of what I mean by debt slavery. So here's some: medical debt, student loan debt, payday loan debt, and credit card debt. I bet some of you watching this video have at least one of those forms of debt, maybe multiple. If so, it's very likely that you are a debt slave. Not universal. I'm not saying everybody who has this is a debt slave, but many of us in these situations are debt slaves. In each of these cases, people assume debt out of a situation of desperation. You're sick and you need some really serious surgeries at the hospital. You need education in order to access better paying jobs in society. So you take out student loans. People who become doctors and lawyers take out hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans. You can't pay all of your bills in a month. So you take out a payday loan to get an advance to pay off your bills until your next paycheck. Or you spent more money than you could pay on your credit card, and now you're paying an interest rate somewhere between 26 and 32% annually of the bill. Why are these types of slavery? Well, two reasons. First of all, in most cases, these systems of loans have the law enforcing their policy. So if you don't pay, the person who holds your debt can seize your paycheck, they can seize your assets, your property, anything they need to do to get what you owe them. And the state will enforce them trying to seize your stuff. Okay? Thus, if we get caught in this form of debt, we're going to work to pay off the debt because we don't want them taking our stuff. Okay? So we're now in a forced work relationship. Secondly, these loans that I've just listed tend to be structured in a way that it takes you years, even decades, to get out from under the debt. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you owe $2,000 in credit card debt at a 26% annual rate, and you can only pay $100 a month on the debt. That's all you have to put towards it. You don't have the 2,000, okay? At that rate, it will take you more than 2 years to pay off that debt. I mean, $2,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but at that rate, it'll take you more than 2 years. And in the process, you're going to pay an additional $650 in interest. So on an original debt of 2,000, you're now paying 2,650, which is more than a quarter added on to the debt. When these debts reach into the tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, they can trap people for life paying off these debts. Slavery is a form of forced work, and unjust debt structures are one way we are forced to work. Now I'm to the controversial one. This is the fourth category of slavery, wage slavery. This is the one that's going to have a few of you scratching your heads because you might have been thinking up to this point, well, wait a minute, isn't the solution to all these problems to make it so that people are fairly compensated for their work. As long as you're getting an honest wage, a fair wage for your work, then it's not slavery, right? Well, no, that has nothing to do with it. Notice what I've been repeatedly saying. Forced work is slavery. If you have to work for somebody, you are a slave. Okay, you're not obviously necessarily a chattel slave or a caste slave or a debt slave. There are different types of slavery, but I want to suggest many of us who have to work do so because we are wage slaves. Let's talk a little bit about compensation. Um, First of all, if you work for a boss, who owns your work? Not you, right? The idea is that you're working for someone else. They own your work and they pay for it with a wage. Okay. So if we have this sense that it would be okay if the laborer gets paid a fair wage for their work, what counts as a fair wage? How do you know if you're getting paid a fair wage? Well, the answer, I think, comes from a most surprising source. The famed moral philosopher and father of capitalism, Adam Smith, I actually think gives the best and fairest and most just conception of what a true fair wage would be when he describes the conditions under which a just exchange of labor and compensation would happen, which he calls the condition of perfect liberty. This is a quote, where every man is perfectly free both to choose what occupation he thinks proper and to change it as often as he thinks proper. End quote. Now, what does that mean? He means that a just labor market is one where the person hiring the laborer and the laborer themselves are true equals at the bargaining table. If I don't think you're offering me a fair wage, I can leave. I don't have to take the job. I can go somewhere else. The laborer can refuse to work for a bad offer. And by comparison, the hiring manager also can refuse to fill the job if they think the laborer is demanding too high of wages. Okay, so there's this negotiation, and perfect liberty is when both of them are equally able to walk away from the negotiation table. So, a fair wage is a wage that is negotiated under those conditions. And therein lies the problem. The bargaining table, the negotiating table for wage labor is rarely ever equal. Most employers hold an immense amount of power over their workforce. This is because an employer can often afford to go without a particular bit of labor for days, weeks, months, even years, because a firm, a company, they have a lot of money saved up, so they can draw on that if they need. And they can just make the employees they already have pull extra shifts and do the work in your absence while they wait for you to be willing to take a lower wage. So they can just wait you out when you try to demand a fair wage. Why can't you wait them out? Well, because you don't usually have as much money as they do. You need to pay rent and buy food and pay off your credit cards and all these other things. So you have bills, monthly bills that require you to be working and bringing in a paycheck every single month. And that makes it so that you can't afford not to work. And employers, they know this. They know that you have to work. So they use your desperation to exploit this fact to gain cheap labor, to make it so that you are willing to work for less than a fair wage because you are desperate to at least make something to pay your monthly bills. This is even more true when there are a lot of laborers available. Because that means if you turn down the offer because you're like, oh, I demand more money, they'll be like, yeah, no big deal. Go ahead. I'm going to hire the next person in line. I don't need you. You're just a number. And see, in those conditions, again, it is not a condition of perfect liberty. It is not an equal negotiating table. Now, I want you to just think about a couple extremes here, just so that you can see the obviousness of Adam Smith's point. Suppose you do 70 hours of difficult labor in a week and you get paid $5 for all of it. Is that unfair? I think most of us wants to say yes, but why? What's unfair about it? Well, it seems that it's the kind of thing where for that much work and that little compensation, it shouldn't be worth it to the person to do it. So the only reason they would be doing it is because they're that desperate, which means they are being forced to do that much labor for that little compensation. Now, there is a reverse scenario where there's a similar kind of exploitation from a company's point of view. Let's say you work 1 hour and you get paid $1 million to answer phones, something very mild. That seems like it can be a little unjust too, doesn't it? How could a company be getting more than $1 million of value from an hour of you answering phone calls? Well, I hate to break it to you, that scenario happens all the time. We tend to tolerate that more because we like getting paid $1 million for answering phones. And companies are willing to do that when your work, let's say you're a stock trader, is so valuable that they're going to make $50 million as a result of your phone calls. Well, they're happy to give you 1 million of the 50 million if that means they get to keep the other 49 million. See, that's how that works. And we tend to think like, well, okay, in that case, who cares? Everybody's making a lot of money, but realize that what's going on there is you've recognized the uniqueness of your value if you're the person answering the phones, and you're using that to basically gouge a wage out of this company that is so much higher than all of the people around you who are working much harder and getting paid a lot less. So it's an unfairness in both directions. We just tend to tolerate one a lot more than the other. If you're so desperate for even $5 that you'd work 70 hours a week, you are not a free person. You are a slave to a system that is readily exploiting you to get 65, sorry, that's not right, 69.75 hours of free labor as a result of your desperation, right? I mean, it's probably more than that, but I'm assuming that the $5 is worth a quarter of an hour. The rest of it is just free labor. You're giving them labor and they're not paying you for it. Okay. Um, the only way to not have a system of wage slavery where people must work in order to earn wages to stay alive is to have a world where people do not have to work. It is because of our desperation that we are desperate for wages and therefore at a disadvantage to our employees, our employers. And this, by the way, explains why most companies are kind of authoritarian. I mean, just think about how little we would tolerate what they do if it was the government doing this. I mean, companies can tell you how to dress, they can tell you what opinions you're allowed to have, right? You don't have a freedom of speech in the workplace. Um, uh, Companies, decide like when you can go on vacation, when you're allowed to be sick, when you have personal issues. They decide when you wake up and when you go to bed, um, all kinds of things. And even when you can go to the bathroom is decided by your place of work. So that's an enormous amount of control over people's lives. And I think where that control is a result of unfair labor negotiations, it's a reflection of a wage slavery system. If you're not free to not work, then you are a slave. You are forced to work. Now, I've described 4 systems of slavery here, and they've all concerned humans. I'm not going to make a kind of controversial claim, but I want to say we should think really hard about the way we treat the non-human creatures we share this planet with. For much of the past 8,000 years, humans have found ways to capture animals, domesticate them, and force them to participate in systems of forced labor or mass execution. For the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the forced labor part since I think that's a little more on point here. But both of them, in my view, should constitute a beast slavery system. Just think for a moment of black slaves in the American South chained together digging furrows in a field. Now imagine a team of oxen chained together by a yoke pulling a heavy plow through the field. Are they really that different? I mean, even if we grant that some farmers are very gentle and loving towards their animals, and there certainly were some slave owners who were gentle and perhaps even loving towards their African slaves. In both cases, I don't think we're going to say that therefore justifies them owning the bodies of the slave humans or the slave oxen and just forcing them to plow the field, right? The beasts of burden here are being forced to do this work. And how do we know it's being forced? Because farmers had to invent things like whips and spurs and goads to make them do the work. They're not going to pull that plow down that field unless you goad the team of oxen into doing it. And that, combined with the fact that they are chained together, they are not free to like make a run for it and say, no, no, I don't want to do this, strongly suggests that for much of the agricultural history of humans, humans have been using animals as a type of chattel slave, a beast slave. So since they are no less free to leave the economic exchange than any of the other slaves we've been describing, I think we should consider this a system of slavery as well. And once you put all 5 of these systems together, I think you realize, wow, slavery truly has been pervasive in our world. And it is today. We use systems of domination everywhere to make the economics and the material realities of our lives take place. If you think of the ancient pharaohs using slaves to build the pyramids and the big statues of their likeness, is that really any different than an employer forcing employees to build a tower with their name on it, or a farmer forcing a team of oxen to develop the land according to their vision? In all of these systems, we have somebody dominating somebody else to exploit work out of them. So before we think too highly of ourselves, we should realize that domination is one of the central forms of political relationships. Now, I don't want to end on a negative here. So I just want to kind of gesture to what future lectures and conversations are going to speak to. There are thankfully other ways of relating to each other and the creatures with which we share the planet. So I'm going to talk about these other ways of relating and some problems with them in conversations to come. The first alternative political relation to domination is the relationship of freedom, where far from imposing coercion on another, we instead empower their agency. But there's another relation besides freedom, and that's the relationship of responsibility, where we take responsibility for the life of another and their flourishing. So I just want to leave that with a message of hope that yes, just our discussion of slavery, which is just one form of domination, has shown how pervasive domination really is in political life. But there is hope because there are other forms of political relationships, and we should try to fight for those. Thank you.